Louise, let's first jump into the built environment side of Hong Kong. So, you know, I think it's hard for people to conceive of this pretty small place, 7 million people, half the people living above the 17th floor, and yet that there's this, this incredible open spaces that are preserved. You know, can you give a sense of what those open spaces mean to people and what they have meant historically to people here in Hong Kong?
I have to say that the country park system is quite amazing because it was on the back of one governor, MacLehose at the time. It was 1976, and he decided that he wanted country parks. So he designated 40% of the land for country parks. So this is something that has been part of the Hong Kong culture, and Hong Kong people really love to go to the country parks for hiking, as well as barbecues. Everything about food in Hong Kong. So they do use a lot of the country park facilities, and it's been managed as such. But because of the topography of Hong Kong, a lot of the green spaces are in more of the steep areas or shrubs, so it's not suited for built anyway. So I think what's concentrated is that small piece of land, but that we're building up instead. So I think that has been traditionally the mentality for Hong Kong, but it's also, because it's concentrated in such a small area, you have the opportunity to leave a lot of the wilderness. It's still wild.
So people are really never more than about a mile or a couple of kilometers from essentially tropical rainforest that has got the full complement of species that were typically here, except a few, like tigers. Tigers were extirpated from Hong Kong in the early 1900s. I think that the last recorded tiger in Hong Kong was in the early, like 1908, I think. Elephants would obviously be here too. We don't find any elephants, but we do have a huge...
a lot of boars.
Yeah, we have a lot of very big pig, very big wild boars. So, so the built environment, how could it be better? I mean, you think about air pollution on the streets. You think about sort of friendliness for pedestrianisms, bicycling. Those things, those things are big issues that Hong Kong is wrestling with. You think TNC can play a role in the future on some of those issues as well? The quality of the urban life, the fabric of life here in Hong Kong?
TNC is evolving, and what I appreciate about the New York program, for example, is looking at healthy urban trees. And that's something that is very integral to a lot of the central business districts, where for the most part it's much more concrete. And we don't have influence on the design of the buildings, but we do have an influence on where those trees are being placed and how, as urban planning, that can make a difference. And that is significant in terms of how many people go through this very concentrated place every day.
So switching from sort of that, the built environment, which is this remarkable 7 million people jammed into very tight spaces, most densely populated place on the earth, probably the fastest and best and most efficient mass transit system on the planet.
And money-making.
And money-making, right. The Hong Kong has got a, sort of essentially contracted out their many of the public utilities, like the mass transit, the subway system, and it makes money. It moves 5 million people a day, and they've been contracted to build subways all around the world. So really interesting success story here. So moving from that into the wild side of Hong Kong, it seems to me that more and more people are enjoying the country parks. I live out in the middle of Country Park, and what you'll see now is mainland Chinese tourists coming to Hong Kong. What they used to do was go shopping at Gucci and Chanel, and etc. But what is increasingly you see is that you'll see big groups of mainland Chinese tourists going on hikes. Tell us, is an ecotourism, is that a future for a place like Hong Kong? And was it a past?
See, I think that's where TNC can make a difference, because right now they're projecting a lot of ecotourism in very unsustainable ways. So for example, in Lantau, they have a plan to build cable cars to Sunset Peak. And that's something that is catering towards mass tourism, but it doesn't make an impact, it makes a huge impact on the biodiversity, but it doesn't make a huge impact in terms of the way that it's being managed. So, if you think about it, the country parks have been there since 1976, and they're really due for a shake-up because there's a huge pressure in terms of land development, recreational resources, And you have a lot of groups from the very extreme, the country parks should be regulated so that you don't have that many tourists and you don't have that many hikers. Versus the others would be saying, well, you need people into the country parks to really appreciate the country parks. But there's no set of objective data that can inform those plans. And I think that's where TNC can make the difference.
Is it possible to bring people together? Is that that convening role around these country park values and the biodiversity and the ecosystem services values? Can you bring the existing NGOs community together as a TNC? Can we help to bring that group together and promote those values? Is that sort of a future path for you?
Absolutely, and just taking the case of Lantau, for example, we've been talking to various groups for over 8 months, and from the local community side, they're hungry for an opportunity to really elevate that conversation. If we're coming at it with a financial mindset and looking at financial incentives that can help escalate some of the work that local communities can do even better. And on the other side, the government is really hungry for someone who can moderate a lot of the very vocal voices with something that is practical. Because the local NGOs feel that, okay, we know that development is going to happen anyway, what's our best argument? And on the government side, it's like, we know we have to cater, but what do we need to mitigate? So I think there is appetite on both ends to really find a positive solution.
Now, talk a little bit Hong Kong's role in the region. In this perspective, it's a pretty unique city, right? I mean, there's no other Asian city that has this kind of country park, urban density that's just slam bang next to each other. Nobody else has this. So, is that a competitive advantage? Is it something that you can help to export to places like Guangzhou or Kunming or Jakarta or other places in the region?
Certainly in terms of the land management and of the country parks, that's something that has been in the DNA for a long time. But I think there's also the exchange in terms of how other people are doing it as well. What I think is also important is that the government needs to use this data and use proper management strategies to communicate to the public. Because the public take it for granted because it's been there for so long. And it's mainstreaming the whole biodiversity story that's been a block for them. And TNC can also play a role in that.
It's pretty remarkable that you have this city that for various historic reasons has ended up where it is, with half, 3/4 of the place is now preserved in open spaces and partially preserved and rural in this place, and there are these instances of kind of remarkable species returning to the waters of Hong Kong. Like a friend of mine saw on a ferry yesterday a pod of dolphins right off the hull of the ferry, surfing in the wave of the ferry. There are, as we mentioned, wild boars. There are still monkeys. There's a whole host of civet cats, etc. So it's a remarkable sort of accident, maybe, but it seems like it's an accident that we can take advantage of and celebrate and get people excited. So let's jump in. I want to talk really quickly about a couple of the projects. Again, the Nature Works project really was sort of a hybrid or an invention of your own, taking and borrowing from some of the work that folks like Bridget had done in New York, the New York chapter, but really was of your own mindset. And sort of backing up a bit again, this is really not a kind of a short program where you just sort of expose people kind of a single impression on their minds. This is a long program. People have to commit to engage and learn skills and then take on a project and move it forward. How have they come out the other end? What's the sort of satisfaction factor for kids?
So we've done a survey in the last 2 years, and it's just testing people's survey and perception. So from the kids' point of view, they feel that they're more entitled to feeling more positive and more in control of their future. And certainly a lot of these students who have applied for university, for example, Ike, he got into Harvard because of the portfolio that he has created because of that. There are other opportunities that, even though they didn't execute the plan in Hong Kong, they brought it with them to university, and they implemented at university. So it's one of those skills that you can carry forth. And a lot of the feedback that we've had, about 96%, have had positive feedback based on that. So in terms of the top of the pyramid and that leadership, we're very comfortable with the program and where it's going. What we're improving upon is the impact on the ground as well. So we're targeting some of the schools and helping to facilitate a lot of that execution and impact. So I think we're rounding out the program in a more cohesive way so that it also has both sides of the coin.
Yeah. Talk a little bit, because I know people are probably curious about it, but talk a little bit about the politics of Hong Kong and versus the politics of China. And not so much your opinions. I'm sure people are interested in that as well. But talk a little bit about how that affects conservation or how that might play. I mean, President Xi has said that he wants and he envisions a China that has clean air and clean water and green fields. He's obviously charged some of his ministries to do that. So can you talk a little bit about that interplay and the sort of what Hong Kong's leadership, is Hong Kong's leadership a little behind the curve on that front? Aren't quite as bought into the President Xi vision, or is it, do they have some things to offer as well?
So the Hong Kong government is a very conservative government. So to move things in the government takes extreme effort. So they're more likely to be more conservative. To give you an example, we were talking about innovation and research and development. And Hong Kong is at 0.8% of the GDP versus places like Shenzhen is at three times the GDP. So that gives you an indication of how conservative the government is. It's not that they're not willing, it's really just the apathy to move things or to be different. So I think that's one. Secondly is, as an institution, the Hong Kong government is banking on a lot of the infrastructure that the British government had left behind. So financial infrastructure, things like security as well as transparency, those are things that are embedded into Hong Kong, and that's what makes Hong Kong more competitive. But at the same time, that is kind of limiting in terms of kind of things like GDP and investments. So for example, Hong Kong imports 70% of the water from Dongjiang, which is southern river of China. And Hong Kong pays 3 times as more than Guangdong, which is just as wealthy, but we're subsidizing basically a lot of that cost. And that's something that is more geared towards being a very conservative government. The other example I can give you is ivory. So Xi Jinping and Obama has said, let's ban ivory, and that was about a year ago. But in Hong Kong, they're looking at it from, we understand that it's a global trend and we are moving towards it, but we're going to move it at our own pace. So what they're proposing is that they will, on the administrative side, just cut the licenses. So they will not issue more licenses. But it's going to be a 5-year process before all the licenses expire. So I don't know if the elephants are going to last the next 5 years. But versus in China, they have the authority to say, okay, we're banning licenses and it's going to stop now, which I think is up for January 2017. So it's an indication of how the government works. It's not all good or all bad, but I think it's just the way that it moves is very slow. Very
slow. So that has some impact, and you have to figure out, okay, how are you going to move particular initiatives or ideas through the government, or go around and figure out how to work with the corporate sector, with communities, etc.
But the good thing is that in 2011, Hong Kong has declared itself as a signatory of the Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan, so the CBD. So subsequently, it's gone through like the consultation process, it's gone through the government, and even though the end result is not as strong as a lot of the local NGOs would like it to be, it's still an indication and it's still a momentum for the AFCD, which is our Fisheries and Agriculture Conservation Department, to push that forth in terms of a mandate to have biodiversity as top of the agenda on a lot of these items, interdepartment.
Gotcha. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, which we appreciate, and please keep typing them into your chat box. We'll get to them. I think we've got about 20 minutes left. one of these things which I think kind of runs off of our earlier conversation, one of the questions, what can other cities around the world learn from Hong Kong in terms of environmental or urban sustainability? Are there some particular lessons that stick in your mind? You know, is it the MTR, the public transportation system? Is it the preservation of the parks? You know, what's the highlight for you? If you're looking at Hong Kong, you're thinking, you know, why did you come back here from Toronto? You know, what was attractive from the environment and urban sustainability perspective? Or, you know, if you were living in Toronto now, why would you want to come back here?
I think because Hong Kong is so concentrated, you have a lot of mobility. So you can go to the next best, you know, in Hong Kong Island, you can go from end to end in 15 minutes. So I think transportation and the way that urban planning has been done is quite unique, and I think it's very efficient. Mm-hmm. So we do have like traffic jams, but you know, what city doesn't? Yeah. But the way that they're thinking about it is actually quite a good reference. But the preservation of the country parks is something that I would go on and on about, because it is infrastructure that's there. It can be done better, and there's still a lot of room for improvement. But to have that as designated and to have that as part of the government remit to protect, I think that is something that is quite unique to Hong Kong.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing I think that system brings to mind is the ratio of cars to people. So in Hong Kong, there's 500,000 cars and buses and taxis that serve 7 million people. So that's a 1 car to 14 person ratio, whereas in the United States, it's 2 cars for every 1 person. So it's a pretty dramatic you know, difference in terms of footprint, I think, on the planet and the use of public transportation.
Well, but it's a trade-off because it's so concentrated, you can get to things, get to meetings very easily. Mm-hmm. So you can be in 3 meetings in Central in just 1 morning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how are you thinking, and how are you working with the China team? Are you thinking about? Here's another question from the audience. You know, are you and Joyce and Zhao Peng and Xiao Chuan, are you all communicating and thinking about the Hong Kong-China relationship more holistically? You know, how are we working more closely together?
Well, definitely, because China team has a great band of scientists. So we're relying on June, for example, on the marine program, and she's part of our team. We kind of adopted her. Yeah. So she's part of our team, and Zhao Peng has been working with us in terms of identifying new opportunities. There's also other opportunities like in Yunnan, where we've had teams and celebrities and more awareness building on the golden monkeys and bringing it to Hong Kong. So telling that story that to the urban environment, that's something that we're building up as well. So I look forward to working with the China team more closely, especially as they grow the Sustainable Cities program. Mm-hmm. And that's something that very much on my mind, because in Hong Kong, we don't want to have like a huge team. We mm-hmm. want a team that can leverage a lot of the resources, both from China as well as internationally. Mm-hmm. So we welcome all the scientists to participate in our program here. Right, but I think Tuya from our Mongolia program describes it as she's going to beg, borrow, and steal all the expertise she can get. There you go. So Hong Kong is really, here's another question from the audience. Hong Kong is an international trading hub. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, in some cases, because of the wildlife trade, and is a wildlife hub for trade. What's the Hong Kong program, the China program doing on wildlife trade, and can they do more? Yes. So the way that I talk about wildlife trade is that we have a very strong program on the supply side. So Africa program is very strong on managing that piece. We have a very strong program on the demand side in terms of the China program working on reducing consumption on that end. We've been looking at Hong Kong as a trade and a hub, and whether our opportunity here is to look at influencing policy that can switch that. But we've been looking at some other potential options. So for example, is it worthwhile to do a public opinion survey and see how the public can push the government to act faster? Mm-hmm. So that's something that the ballot initiatives in the US have experimented with and has great success. Mm-hmm. So first of all, we didn't have funding for that, so the funding didn't come through. But the other thing that we're looking at is, where is TNC most strategically placed? And in the wildlife trade, you have a lot of great partners on the ground that's working on things like Wild Day, WWF, as well as traffic. So what expertise or what niche does TNC play in that role is still to be determined for Hong Kong. The other thing about wildlife trade is that in Hong Kong, the it's been motioned that it will ban ivory eventually. It's just taking very, very slowly. So that's something that in terms of prioritization of our current programs, there's a lot that we can do on the other things versus waiting it out for this wildlife piece. But the other things that we were considering, for example, was traditional Chinese medicine, where Hong Kong has been a hub to create the East meets West type of standardization for Chinese medicine. And a lot of the time, a lot of the wildlife parts are used for the Chinese medicine. So that was one area where we were looking at, but again, it comes down to funding and prioritization.
And I mean, I don't want to diminish the work that you've already done here in Hong Kong around demand reduction, because it is significant. I mean, you're working through the media, the social media platforms that you've created here, membership, etc., through partners media like Karen Mock, raising awareness around the Wildlife Trade Fest, because Hong Kong is also not just a trading hub, but it's also a consumption destination. So, I mean, I think the stuff that you've been doing is pretty interesting as well on that front. I wouldn't sell that short at all. Let's see. One of the things Hong Kong has been, another question from the crowd, that Hong Kong's been known for are its successful galas, raising funds for the region. Can you share how the fundraising will move forward now that there's also a program on the ground? How are you thinking about, both doing conservation here in Hong Kong, but also engaging donors in the broader region, and how do the two complement each other?
So our fundraising strategy has always been, let's start with the biggest ask, which is AP unrestricted. So we always go into the discussion being as broad as possible. So bearing that, then we get into donors' interest levels as well as different things, and then we customize whatever the donor is more interested in. So of course there are donors who are more interested in regional, because in Hong Kong a lot of regional headquarters are based here. But there's also a lot of interest in what's happening in the backyard, and that's just the nature of conservation. So we're making that balance. But as an objective for the Hong Kong program, we are looking at, we're raising funds for Hong Kong, but we're also raising twice that for Asia Pacific as well. And that has been our goal, and that will continue to be our goal. With Asia Pacific, with the galas, that's something that has, in general, netted us like 3 to 6 million, depending on the different galas, and that's something that we will continue to pursue. That is good for unrestricted type of funding as well. So that's something that in Hong Kong is very much a social market like in New York. So these social galas are very beneficial, and it's something that is a norm, actually.
Have you felt, before we started the conservation work here on the ground, it seemed that we were leaving money on the table in terms of local interest in local programs like coral reef or oyster or lantau or the education, the work, or even wildlife trade, that wouldn't have been able to be raised except for the work here on the ground. Do you think that the work here on the ground and then having this footprint here lends you credibility? When people want to be able to see something and go to places?
Well, I think of it not as either or, but it's a very complementary space. Because in the past, when we've had the galas, these were the audience that just attend the gala, they give money, and they don't necessarily care about conservation. Then there are people who are more regionally minded and are more open to different conservation programs. They love diving, or they like to go to Indonesia, for example. So that's something that we've been able to capture that audience through a more concentrated effort on philanthropy side. But at the same time, in Hong Kong, you still have those corporations or individuals whose remit is Hong Kong plus China, or even just Hong Kong. So those are some of the opportunities where we're looking at tapping into that with a Hong Kong-based type of program, or with a Hong Kong China slash China type of program. But kind of as like a foundation level, Hong Kong is still a developing city. If you think about the economy, created in the 70s and really the first generation of wealth. But the first generation wealth, if you kind of look at the historical factors, the philanthropy tends to be poverty alleviation, giving back to schools and different things around health. So that's first generation giving. What we're finding now in Hong Kong is that there's a second generation that's coming up and coming, so it's like 30s and 40s, who will eventually be the tycoons of the future. And these people are looking at different types of investments. So things like impact investing. How are they getting return on investment? How are they looking at education, not just as a one-off in scholarship, but how are you empowering them so that they can fish for themselves? So those are type of templates or approaches that we've not had before, and that's what we're evolving the program to be.
Yeah. Now Hong Kongers have always been travelers. They've traveled around, is another question, I'll sort of modify a little bit, around the region. I mean, you basically, for forever, until 1997, you really couldn't go into mainland China, and now Hong Kongers are traveling into China, and now increasingly Chinese tourists are traveling around the region. Both the Hong Kong travelers and mainland Chinese travelers, and all of us really as we travel as tourists, are going to have impacts. Are there better ways that we can educate tourists in places like Palau, where reefs are critical and fragile? Are there better ways we can bring the kind of education before they go to be more sensitive about these things? As one of our, Trina asks this question about tourists visiting Palau particularly can sometimes cause damage to the very thing that they're going to come see. Is that a role that we could play here in Hong Kong, or is that mostly something that you're going to be able to have to do on the plane or on arrival?
I think it's a combination. So certainly there are opportunities to do education in Hong Kong. So say, for example, the diving community in Hong Kong is large-ish, but it's not huge. So there are opportunities for us to partner with people on the ground to do more of the eco-training. And certainly if we had the opportunity to do coral restoration, that can be part of the outreach strategy moving further down the line. So that's something that they can train locally, both in terms of certification as well as education and ecotourism. But at the same time, there are also opportunities to visit places like Palau. And I think what Trina had been saying was Jellyfish Lake. One of them is like a sacrificial lake that everybody goes to. So that could be one opportunity to look at conservation and have that conservation fee go back into conservation of jellyfish in other areas. So it's just a combination.
Okay. All right, well, I think that's pretty much it. That's all the questions I've got, and we need to wrap up. One last thought, over the next, we've been in the Asia-Pacific region for 25 or so years. We've been here in Hong Kong for, 16, 17, 18 years, depending on how you count them. What would you say, how would you complete the sentence? In the next 25 years, I'd like for TNC Hong Kong to do blank.
I'm very partial because I'm actually biased, because I feel that the most important role that TNC can play is in the urban setting. Because there was a statistic, 2050, 9 billion people in the world and 60% will be living in cities. That's nowhere is that more true than in Asia Pacific. And if we can get it right in terms of either green infrastructure, working with urban planning, eco shorelines, for example, those are specific areas where it can make the most impact. And moving like 10, 20 years later, that's going to be where it has significant influence on people. And that's where the story ends.
Great. So we know that, if you're successful, and the Hong Kong will become a dive destination, ecotourism, we'll have restored oysters in the bay here, clean water, visibility in the water for 10 meters. We'll have wild animals in the open in the parks, and a whole crew of people who care deeply about the national parks here in Hong Kong. And
a new generation of young leaders that can move things forward.
Right. Excellent.
So,
cool. Well, that's a good vision. I'm for it.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.